Welcome back. Week 10. Week 9 was break. Now it's week 10 here in the history of psychology. And we're starting to come on to some more the ways in which the history of psychology is covering changes in the field of psychology, but these are now current and modern theories within psychology. We're talking about behaviorism, which is alive and well in psychology. So this chapter, chapter 9, looks at the antecedent influences, the thing that leads up to what we now know as behaviorism, the work of primarily around B.F. Skinner. We get to see some characters coming in here. The first of them is John Watson, who's going to be more prominent in next chapter, but Watson, who was a controversial figure, aside from all of this, we'll get into that next time. He felt that all this introspection stuff that was going on was all for the birds. He did not think that that was real science. He felt science, and it's science that works on the observable and the measurable, and that's what psychology should focus on. It's an extreme. There's lots of experiences that we can't observe directly, and he felt that those fall outside the field of psychology. They're not worthy of studying. So, an extreme view, but sometimes that's what moves the needle, gets people to think a little bit about the way we've been assuming, or at least up until that time, what we've been assuming goes on in human psychology. It opens up the door for some pretty deep research, real critical application of the theories of science and hypotheses and testing and whatnot that really ushered in the powerful force that we know of as behaviorism today. So one of the things that we have to also understand in terms of its history is this is during a period of time, a very long and continuing period of time, where we see the notion of comparative psychology. Now, comparative psychology runs on the assumption that less complex animals are simply less complex versions of ourselves. That evolution states that the underlying genetic code that we have arose from simpler animals. So therefore, to understand some of the most basic aspects of human behavior, we can study animal behavior and then to some degree extrapolate that to humans. So what we can understand in terms about emotional, cognitive, sensory, and whatnot behaviors from animals as best that we can make some assumptions about human beings. Still happening today. That's why we have animal testing that we have, and there's certainly lots of validity behind that presumption. So that is the context in which this exists. Lots of work with these early scientists were done with animals. Whether those studies could be done today because of our relatively newer perception of animal rights and whatnot is a little aside from the point. Those rules were not there at the time, certainly a different time of history. So let's look at a couple of the major theorists that come along here. We have, of course, Ivan Pavlov, a Russian physiologist who was studying the gastroenterological systems of dogs, and through his keen observation, introduced us to the concept of classical conditioning. Now, conditioning is a word that we use interchangeably with learning. Classical, he didn't call it classical. We call it classical because it happened before operant conditioning. So classical conditioning, which came around first, then we have operant conditioning later. So classical conditioning, this basic sense of learning by association. You took it in Intro to Psych when we were talking about the learning chapter. When we're talking about learning, you were introduced to Pavlov's dogs. And so his dogs that were hooked up to salivation, they had a tube in their mouth, inserted into their mouth to measure the saliva, found out that if he took an unconditioned stimulus, which produced an unconditioned response, food, producing salivation, and he paired the unconditioned stimulus with a neutral stimulus, such as a bell, and did that over repeated trials. Eventually, that bell acquired the same capacity to bring about the stimulus that the food did. So now we call the bell a conditioned or a learned stimulus, and the salivation that results from a learned stimulus we call a conditioned response. So that whole learning process by which we connect the dots between that bell and getting food, which accounts in modern day, that accounts for about 80% of what we know is associated learning. So this is huge in us. When we recognize a face and we have a name, when we look at an object and we know what that object tastes like, this is all different aspects of classical conditioning. Then Thorndike comes along, and Thorndike was doing all kinds of interesting studies on human behavior, working with animals and with human beings. And he presents us with a very, very interesting thing. And that is, as far as I'm aware, I can't remember what the other one is, but there are only 3 laws within the science of psychology. When you study physics, there's the law of entropy, the law of gravity, there's a law, thermodynamics, all of that. There's laws up the yin yang. Biology, there's the laws that things operate on laws. Human beings, not so much. Laws imply that this is so consistent that we can pretty much expect it every time. In fact, if we can't directly observe it, when you can't directly observe a law, you're probably wrong in your observation. It is that critical. So we don't take this word law very, very, very easy in terms of psychology. So the 2 laws that Thorndike introduced that are so fascinating is what is called the law of effect. And that is the consequence of a behavior, whether it be satisfying to the individual or unsatisfying to the individual, affects the frequency of that behavior. This is pure logic, but now that it's encompassed into a law, it starts to have some very, very profound implications. It means if you're observing a behavior that's existing in the wild, you watch your kids do something really strange, something is satisfying about that. That's the law. If it was unsatisfying, they wouldn't do it. And this goes across the entire animal kingdom. The second one is the law of exercise. And that is, we engage in a behavior. The more often it gives us a satisfying response or feeling, the stronger that behavior becomes. The more often it gives us a negative, the weaker that behavior comes. These 2 laws delineated the basic idea of rewards and punishments that we're going to see so eloquently put together by B.F. Skinner in the next class. So these 2 laws, the law of effect and the law of exercise, pretty much, you can think of it logically. I put my hand on a hot stove and it burns, I'm going to take it away. It's going to reduce that behavior. Now, if the learning happens, some associative learning here, hot stoves produce pain, but if every time I go to do that, eventually I'm just going to stop doing it. It doesn't work. It's always going to be hot. Stoves are not always hot. But if there's no other indicator, let's say I have one of those stoves that doesn't, into a stove that doesn't light up. Mine is one of those, the grill things are underneath glass, so it lights up when it's hot. Turn those off, there's no light telling you, just a light on the stove telling you the surface is hot. So outside of the direct indicator that the stove is still hot, if every time I put my hand on that, it's been hot, I won't put my hand on there even when it's cold, because that consistent negative stimulus at the end of that behavior is keeping me from doing that. Same as a light switch. You go in, you're going to do the light switch a couple times, and then you're just going to stop using the light switch because it's not working. Or the opposite. If you've learned that it takes 5 jiggles before the light comes on, you'll go in and go get those 5 out of the way and do it. It reinforces that behavior. We're going to get more deeply into that when we talk about behaviorism itself. Right now we're looking at setting the ground, the antecedent philosophies associated with these types of learning. So the discussion goes with this. We're going to examine and discuss the idea of how much can we assume from animals relates to human beings. To what degree do we do that? Now, we have the tendency to attribute very human characteristics to our animals. The animals are happy, the animals are sad, all of those things, they're happy to see me, they miss me while I'm gone, and all this stuff. And all of this is subject to some critique as to how much animals actually process this kind of information. But looking at this genetically, looking at it behaviorally, can we make that jump looking at behavior of other animals and us? And which animals? Can I look at a slug and make assumptions about human behavior? Can I look at a great ape, of which we're one? Can we make that connection? So let's have a discussion about the use of animals, not a focus on animal cruelty and the rights of animals per se. That's an argument, but it's not what I'm looking for here. What I'm looking for is philosophically, how do we make this connection? And maybe talk about your own pets and the only animals in your world, and how much can you assume, maybe with some examples about what their behavior and how you would react in similar ways. So use animals that way. The assignment has to do with an exercise in classical conditioning. Now, the application of classical conditioning, learning by association, is most relevantly examined with advertising. So I have an advertisement here that I'm going to bring up. So advertising attempts to place a product with an image that evokes an emotion from a target audience. This is an assignment that if you took Intro to Psych, this was the assignment in the classical conditioning chapter, the learning chapter, where I gave you an advertisement. It was a girl, up until now, it's been a girl holding a tray of Coca-Cola, and you had to describe that ad using the terms from classical conditioning. So here's another example. So this advertisement is for Colgate toothpaste. Now, first and foremost, when we think about who's going to find this ad attractive, it is probably women who find that powerful, athletic women are cool. I want to be like that. We have this woman, she's taping up her hands like a boxer. She has that intense feeling, an intense look on her face. She's beautiful. She has perfect teeth. She has it's not a mean face, it's a determined face. So this would catch somebody's eye. So let's describe this in terms of classical conditioning. Remember that in classical conditioning, we have a unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. That's the first thing. Now that has to do with, when we're looking at advertisements, is based on the target audience, what would they see, what would they be attracted to, and what emotion would it elicit. So if I'm a woman who has desire to be a strong, powerful woman, I would find this image to be evoking a sense of power, womanness, looking good, but yet being strong and all that. So this image elicits in me that feeling. Then we think about, well, what's the neutral stimulus? It's always the product. Whatever they're trying to sell, that's the neutral stimulus. So just like Pavlov did with the bell and the food, We have placed the product in close proximity to this image that's evoking this emotion. So now, if the learning occurs, the toothpaste down at the right-hand corner now elicits the same sort of sense of strength, beauty, power, womanhood that the original image did. Now we know it seems kind of silly that we would now get that feeling from toothpaste, but it's not that we walk along, pick up Colgate and go, I'm a powerful woman. That's not how that works. What it does, however, it links those two ideas together in just an instant. So the next time I'm in the store looking for toothpaste, I might skip over the AIM. I might skip over, what's another one? The other toothpaste, and I might pick Colgate Crest. That's what I was trying to get. I skip over AIM, I skip over Crest. Now I'm looking at Colgate, and I'm picking up that one, just a little bit influencing of my decision. It seems silly, but boy, it works. It works really well. What I want you to do, just what I did, okay? You find an ad online in a magazine, scan it, goes right into the document. What am I looking for here? It's a whatever. I think it's a slideshow or something, maybe a slideshow or whatever, however you want to do it. Title page, put the advertisement there, and then tell me what all those pieces are. And I'm asking you also to tell me who's the audience. Describe the audience. Whenever advertising company puts together a piece of advertising, they're always targeting a particular population, a population that gives predictable results, has predictable feelings about this particular ad. And the degree to which this ad is successful is the degree to which that image of the woman holding on to that tape with her teeth actually elicits that emotion of power, and how well that gets associated with the toothpaste that results in sales. Very effective use of psychology. Okay, that's it for chapter 9. In addition to chapter 9, we also have the article review that's due this week. I know a lot of you have already submitted that, so I'm going to be starting grading that and getting into that. Get those articles done. Get that article review done. It's going to be due by the end of this week. That's one of the special assignments that's in this class. And good luck with that. All right, so I'll be beginning to grade those this week. So have a great week. Have a great week with this chapter. Look forward to having that discussion about how animals can be compared to human beings in terms of understanding our behavior. And have a great day.